The blood on her feet left crimson stains against the pristine white snow, each footprint a desperate testament to survival, as Winona Edwards stumbled through the blizzard that had descended upon the Colorado mountains without warning. She had been walking for 3 hours since the stagecoach accident, her boots lost somewhere in the ravine along with her carpet bag and every possession she owned, her thin traveling dress offering no protection against the February cold of 1882. The other passengers had scattered in different directions after the coach tumbled down the embankment. The driver killed instantly when his neck snapped against a boulder, and Winona had chosen what she hoped was the path toward Aspen, though the whiteout conditions made navigation impossible. Her legs trembled with each step, muscles screaming in protest as frostbite began its cruel work on her exposed toes. She wrapped her arms around herself, teeth chattering so violently she worried they might crack. The wind howled through the pine trees like a wounded animal, and she knew with grim certainty that she would not survive another hour in these conditions. 22 years old, and her life would end in this frozen wilderness, her body not discovered until spring thaw revealed her frozen corpse to some unlucky prospector. Then, through the curtain of falling snow, she heard it, the steady rhythm of hoofbeats. Winona tried to call out, but her voice emerged as barely a whisper, her vocal cords seized by the cold. She waved her arms instead, stumbling forward with renewed desperation, and nearly collapsed when a massive dark horse materialized from the storm, its rider sitting tall in the saddle despite the brutal conditions. "Jesus Christ," the man said, dismounting in one fluid motion. He was perhaps 25, with dark hair plastered to his forehead beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and eyes the color of whiskey that widened in shock as he took in her condition. "Madam, what in God's name happened to you?" "Stage," Winona managed through frozen lips. "Accident." He did not waste time with more questions. Instead, he immediately bent down and began unlacing his boots, his fingers working quickly despite the cold. "These'll be too big, but they're better than nothing," he said. His name was Harrison James, though she would not learn that for several more minutes. He pulled off his boots, revealing thick wool socks beneath, and then removed those as well. "Put these on first," he said, handing her the socks, then steadying her when she nearly toppled over trying to lift her foot. Her fingers were too numb to function properly, so he knelt in the snow, now in his bare feet, and gently took her foot in his hands. His touch was careful, almost reverent as he examined the damage. "You've got frostbite starting," he said grimly. "We need to get you warm, but slowly. Too fast and you'll lose your toes." He pulled the sock onto her right foot, then the left, his own feet now pressed into the same snow that had nearly killed her. Then came the boots, far too large as he had warned, but gloriously warm from his own body heat. The leather held his warmth like a gift, and Winona felt tears freeze on her cheeks. "You cannot," she protested weakly. "Your feet." "I've got my horse," Harrison said, standing and brushing snow from his knees. "And I'm not the one who's been walking barefoot for God knows how long." Without another word, he swept her into his arms, lifting her as though she weighed nothing at all. He was strong, she realized, the kind of strength that came from years of hard work rather than mere size. He carried her to his horse, a magnificent bay gelding that stood perfectly still despite the storm, and somehow managed to mount while still holding her, settling her sideways across his lap. "There's a lined shack about 2 miles east," he said, wrapping his coat around her as best he could while keeping hold of the reins. "Built it myself last summer. We'll hole up there until this blows over." He urged the horse forward, and Winona felt the animal's powerful muscles moving beneath them, carrying them both through the storm. She drifted in and out of consciousness during the ride, aware only of the warmth of Harrison's body against hers, the steady beating of his heart beneath her ear, and the way his arms held her secure against the horse's movement. She heard him talking, a steady stream of words meant to keep her awake, telling her about the ranch he worked, about the cattle that would need feeding once the storm passed, about anything and everything to keep her tethered to consciousness. "Stay with me," he said when her eyes fluttered closed. "Come on now, stay awake, talk to me. What's your name?" "Winona," she mumbled. "Winona Edwards." "Pretty name," he said. "Where were you headed?" "Winona Edwards, Aspen, position, teaching." "A school teacher," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice despite her diminishing awareness. "Well, Miss Edwards, I promise to get you there alive, but you have to fight. Keep your eyes open. That's it. Good girl." The line shack appeared suddenly through the snow, a small structure that looked barely large enough for one person, let alone two. Harrison dismounted carefully, keeping Winona cradled against his chest, and kicked the door open. The interior was pitch black and bitterly cold, but it was shelter, and shelter meant survival. He laid her on the single narrow cot against the wall, then worked with swift efficiency in the darkness. She heard him moving around, heard the scratch of a match, saw the sudden flare of light as he lit an oil lamp hanging from a ceiling hook. Then he was at the small potbelly stove, building a fire with practiced hands, coaxing flames from kindling and logs he had clearly stored during that summer construction he had mentioned. Only when the fire was burning steadily did he sit down and examine his own feet. They were bright red from cold, and Winona felt a wave of guilt wash over her. "Your feet," she said, her voice stronger now in the relative warmth of the cabin. "Will be fine," Harrison said firmly. "I've had worse. You, on the other hand, need proper attention." He pulled a blanket from a chest in the corner and wrapped it around her shoulders, then carefully removed his boots from her feet, followed by the socks. Her feet looked terrible, white and mottled with patches of gray, and she saw his jaw tighten. "This is going to hurt," he warned. "I need to warm them slowly. If you need to scream, you go ahead and scream. No one out here to hear but me and the horse, and neither of us will judge." He was right. It hurt worse than anything Winona had ever experienced, a burning, stabbing pain that made her bite down on the blanket to keep from crying out. Harrison held her feet gently in his hands, breathing warm air on them, massaging them with careful pressure, bringing the circulation back with agonizing slowness. He never stopped talking, a steady stream of words meant to distract her from the pain. "I work for the Double Bar Ranch," he said. "Been there 3 years now. Came out from Missouri after my father died, left my mother and sisters with my uncle. Send money back when I can. Always plan to make something of myself out here, save enough to start my own spread someday. The foreman says I've got a gift with horses, and I suppose that's true enough. Never met a horse I could not gentle, though I've met plenty that tried to kill me first." Despite the pain, Winona found herself listening, grateful for the distraction. His voice was deep and soothing, with a slight drawl that spoke of southern roots. His hands never stopped their careful work, bringing her feet back from the edge of permanent damage with patient determination. "What about you?" he asked. "What brings a schoolteacher to Aspen in the dead of winter?" "Necessity," Winona said, gasping as another wave of pain washed through her. "My father died last year. Debts. I needed work, and Aspen offered a position. I sold everything we had left to afford the journey from Boston." "Boston," Harrison said with a low whistle. "That's a far piece from here." "This must seem like the end of the earth to you." "It seemed like death about an hour ago," Winona admitted. "You saved my life. I did what anyone would do. You gave me your boots. You walked barefoot in the snow. That's not what just anyone would do." Harrison looked up at her then, his whiskey eyes meeting hers in the lamplight, and something passed between them, a recognition of sorts, an acknowledgement of a connection neither could name. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but I could not have lived with myself if I had left you there." The storm raged outside for the rest of the day and through the night. Harrison kept the fire fed, melted snow for drinking water, and produced hardtack and jerky from his saddlebags for supper. It was the worst food Winona had ever eaten and somehow the best, sustenance that meant survival. Her feet gradually returned to a more normal color, though Harrison warned her that she would need to be careful for days to come, that the damage was not insignificant. As darkness fell fully, they found themselves talking in the way that strangers sometimes do when circumstances force intimacy. Harrison told her about growing up on a farm in Missouri, about the younger sisters he missed, about his dreams of one day owning land of his own. Winona told him about her father, a professor who had lost everything to gambling debts, about the shame of selling their house to pay creditors, about her determination to make a new life in the West. "Are you frightened?" Harrison asked as the wind howled outside. "Being out here, so far from everything you know." "Terrified," Winona admitted, "but more frightened of the alternative, of ending up dependent on relatives who made it clear they considered me a burden. At least here, I have a chance to build something of my own." "That takes courage," Harrison said, "more than most people have." "Or desperation," Winona said with a weak smile. "Sometimes they are the same thing," Harrison replied. "I reckon desperation drove me west too after Father died and I saw what my future looked like if I stayed. But desperation that leads to something better, that's just courage under another name." They fell silent for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the storm outside. Then Harrison said, almost hesitantly, "You should try to get some sleep. You need rest to heal." "I'll keep watch, make sure the fire stays lit." "There's only one cot," Winona observed. "I'll be fine on the floor. Don't be ridiculous. You've already sacrificed enough for me today. We can share. I trust you." The words surprised her even as she said them, but they were true. Despite having known this man for less than 12 hours, despite the impropriety of their situation, she did trust him. He had given her his boots, carried her through a blizzard, tended her injuries with gentle hands, and never once made her feel anything but safe. Harrison hesitated, clearly torn between propriety and practicality. Finally, practicality won. "All right," he said, "but I'll stay on top of the blankets, keep everything proper." They arranged themselves on the narrow cot, Winona beneath the blankets, Harrison lying stiffly on top, trying to take up as little space as possible. But the cot was small, and eventually exhaustion overrode discomfort. Winona fell asleep with her back pressed against Harrison's chest, his arm draped carefully over her waist, his breath warm against her hair. It was the first time she had felt truly safe since her father's death, and she slept deeply despite the pain in her feet. When she woke, pale morning light filtered through the single window, and the storm had passed. Harrison was already up, stoking the fire and melting more snow. He smiled when he saw her awake, a genuine smile that transformed his face from merely handsome to something that made her heart skip. "Morning," he said. "How are the feet?" Winona carefully flexed her toes beneath the blanket. They hurt, but the pain was different now, more of an ache than the burning agony of the night before. "Better," she said. "Thanks to you. We should stay put today," Harrison said. "Let your feet heal more before trying to move you. I need to check on the cattle tomorrow, but the ranch knows I might hole up during a storm. They won't expect me back until the weather clears for good." So they spent another day in the tiny line shack. and if propriety demanded, they should have been uncomfortable with the enforced intimacy. Neither seemed able to muster the appropriate concern. Instead, they talked more, sharing stories and dreams, learning each other in the way that forms the foundation of real friendship and sometimes something more. Harrison told her about the land he wanted to buy, a valley about 10 miles from Aspen where a creek ran year-round and the grass grew thick enough to support a good-sized herd. "I've got most of the money saved," he said. "Another year or two of working for the double bar and I'll have enough. I want to build something that lasts, something I can pass down to my children someday." "It sounds wonderful," Winona said, and meant it. She could picture it. A small ranch house, cattle grazing in green meadows, children playing by the creek. It was so different from the life she had known in Boston, where her father's world had been one of books and lecture halls, of society dinners and proper behavior that never quite hid the slowly accumulating debts. "What about you?" Harrison asked. "What do you want, beyond the teaching position?" No one had ever asked her that before. Her life had always been defined by necessity, by obligation, by the need to be practical and sensible. But here, in this tiny cabin with this man who had given her his boots, she found herself answering honestly. "I want a home," she said. "A real home, not just a place to sleep. I want to matter to someone. I want to build something that cannot be taken away by bad luck or poor decisions. I want children someday, and I want them to grow up feeling safe and loved. I want a life that is mine." Harrison looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his eyes. "I think you'll get that," he said quietly. "I think anyone strong enough to walk 3 hours through a blizzard barefoot is strong enough to build exactly the life they want." On the third day, Harrison declared her well enough to travel, though he insisted on carrying her again, not trusting her damaged feet to handle the walk. He saddled his horse, a process Winona watched with interest, noting how gentle his hands were as he checked the cinch and adjusted the bridle. The horse clearly trusted him completely, standing perfectly still despite the fresh snow that had fallen overnight. "His name is Chester," Harrison said, catching her watching. "Raised him from a colt. Best horse I've ever known." He lifted her onto Chester's back, then mounted behind her, arranging her side saddle across his lap in a way that was both secure and respectful. They set off through the sparkling white landscape, the sun brilliant overhead in a sky scrubbed clean by the storm. The world looked newborn, pristine, and perfect, and despite the pain that still throbbed in her feet, Winona felt her spirits lift. "How far to Aspen?" she asked. "About 5 miles to town," Harrison said, "but we should probably see about getting you to a doctor first. Make sure those feet heal proper." "I cannot afford a doctor," Winona admitted. "I spent nearly everything I had on the stagecoach ticket and the few possessions I brought with me, all of which are now at the bottom of a ravine." She felt Harrison tense behind her. "Don't you worry about that," he said firmly. "Doc Miller's a good man. He'll see you right and I'll cover what you cannot manage." "I cannot accept that," Winona protested. "You've already done so much." "Consider it a loan then," Harrison said. "Pay me back once you get your first teaching wages, but you need proper medical attention and that's not up for debate." Winona wanted to argue further, but the set of his jaw suggested it would be pointless. Besides, she was secretly relieved. Her feet hurt more than she wanted to admit, and the thought of professional care was appealing despite her pride. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the crunch of Chester's hooves in the snow and the occasional call of a bird. Then Harrison said, "I was thinking about your living situation. Do you have a place arranged in Aspen?" "I was supposed to board with the previous teacher," Winona said, "a Mrs. Harriet Chen. The letter said she had a spare room in her house." Mrs. Chen's a fine woman, Harrison said. But that house is small, and she's got 3 children of her own. Might be cramped quarters for you. My employer's wife, Mrs. Patterson, she runs a respectable boarding house in town for single women. Teachers, nurses, that sort, might be more comfortable, and it's close to the schoolhouse. I will need to see what I can afford, Winona said. Without my belongings, without the small nest egg I had saved, I am starting over with even less than I thought. We'll figure it out, Harrison said, and the casual way he said, we, as though her problems were naturally his concern, made something warm bloom in Winona's chest. Aspen appeared gradually, first a few scattered buildings, then more, until they were riding down a proper main street lined with businesses and homes. It was larger than Winona had expected, clearly a thriving mining town, with the bustle of commerce evident even in the aftermath of the storm. People stopped to stare as they passed, no doubt curious about the woman being carried through town by Harrison James, and Winona felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. Harrison seemed oblivious to the attention, guiding Chester directly to a neat white house with a shingle hanging outside that read, Dr. Robert Miller, physician and surgeon. He dismounted, then carefully lifted Winona down and carried her up the steps to the front door, which opened before he could knock. Harrison, said a middle-aged man with graying hair and kind eyes. Heard there was a stagecoach accident couple days back. This one of the passengers. Yes, sir, Harrison said. Found her walking barefoot through the blizzard. She's got frostbite that needs proper attention. Dr. Miller's expression turned grave. Bring her inside. Let's have a look. The next hour was uncomfortable as Dr. Miller examined her feet, asking questions about the sensation in her toes, testing her reflexes, applying ointment that burned. But his verdict, when it came, was better than Winona had dared hope. You're a lucky woman, Miss Edwards, he said. Another hour or 2 out there and you would have lost toes at minimum. As it is, you'll have some scarring and probable sensitivity to cold for the rest of your life, but you should make a full recovery. Keep them clean, apply this salve twice daily, and for God's sake, stay warm and dry. No walking for at least a week, and even then, take it easy. A week, Winona repeated, dismayed. But I'm supposed to start teaching. The children will survive a week without formal lessons, Dr. Miller said firmly. Your feet will not survive a week of walking on them before they've healed. Young man, he turned to Harrison, I trust you'll make sure she follows my orders. Yes, sir, Harrison said immediately. I'll see to it personal. After settling the bill, which Harrison paid over Winona's protests with a promise that she would indeed pay him back, they headed to Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. It was a large, well-maintained home on a quiet street, with lace curtains in the windows and a garden that probably looked lovely in summer, now buried under snow. Mrs. Patterson herself answered the door. A plump woman in her 50s with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded Winona of her favorite aunt. Those shrewd eyes took in the situation in an instant. Harrison holding Winona, both looking exhausted, Winona wearing boots clearly far too large for her. Harrison James, she said, what have you gotten yourself into now? Nothing improper, madam, Harrison said quickly. This is Miss Winona Edwards, the new schoolteacher. Found her in the blizzard after the stage accident. She needs a place to stay, and I thought of you immediately. Mrs. Patterson's expression softened. The poor dear, bring her in, bring her in. I heard about that accident. Terrible business. The driver, Mr. Thompson, he's being buried tomorrow. Only casualty, thank the Lord. Harrison carried Winona inside to a parlor decorated in florals and dark wood, setting her gently on a sofa. Mrs. Patterson bustled around, calling for tea, demanding details, clucking over Winona's feet when the story came out. "You gave her your boots," she said to Harrison, and there was something in her voice that made both Winona and Harrison look away, embarrassed. "Well, that's quite something, isn't it?" "Anyone would have done the same," Harrison muttered. "No," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "They wouldn't have. But that's neither here nor there. Miss Edwards, I have a room available. It's small but clean with a good bed and a stove. $2 a week includes breakfast and supper. Lunch you'll take at the schoolhouse during term time. Sound agreeable?" "Very," Winona said gratefully. "Though I should tell you I've lost all my possessions in the accident. I'll need to purchase new things, and until I receive my first wages, I'm quite limited in funds." "We'll work something out," Mrs. Patterson said, waving a dismissive hand. "I've got spare linens and such. As for clothes, you're about the size my daughter was before she married and moved to Denver. I've got trunks of her things in the attic, and I'd be happy to see them put to good use rather than gathering dust. We'll consider it part of your room and board for the first month." Winona felt tears prick her eyes at such unexpected kindness. "Thank you," she managed. "Thank you so much." Harrison stayed long enough to carry Winona up to her room, a cozy space under the eaves with a sloped ceiling and a window overlooking the snow-covered garden. He set her on the bed with the same care he had shown throughout their ordeal, then stood awkwardly, clearly reluctant to leave. "I should get back to the ranch," he said. "Check on the cattle, let the foreman know I'm alive, but I'll come back tomorrow. Make sure you're settling in all right, if that's acceptable to you." "More than acceptable," Winona said. "Harrison, I don't know how to thank you. You've done so much for me. Saved my life, paid my doctor's bill, found me lodging. I'm in your debt." "You're not," Harrison said firmly. "There's no debt between us. You'd have done the same for me if situations were reversed." "I would like to think so," Winona said. "But I'm not sure I'd have been brave enough to give up my boots." Harrison smiled at that, a crooked smile that made him look younger. "I reckon you're plenty brave. You walked 3 hours through a blizzard. That's about as brave as it gets." He turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. "I'm glad I found you, Winona Edwards. Real glad." "So am I," Winona said softly. After he left, Mrs. Patterson returned with tea and sandwiches and with her daughter's old clothes, a surprisingly fashionable collection of wool dresses, petticoats, a winter coat, and various necessaries. They fit reasonably well, and Winona felt her spirits lift at having proper clothing again. "He's a good man, that Harrison James," Mrs. Patterson said as she helped Winona into a nightgown. "Been working for the double bar for 3 years now. Honest, hardworking, never causes trouble. Sends money to his family back east. The kind of man a woman could build a life with, if you take my meaning." "We only just met," Winona protested, though she felt her cheeks warm. "Sometimes that's all it takes," Mrs. Patterson said wisely. "One moment, one choice, and everything changes." "He gave you his boots. A man doesn't do that unless he's got a good heart. Mind you remember that." Over the next week, as Winona obediently rested and allowed her feet to heal, Harrison visited daily. He came in the evenings after finishing his work at the ranch, often bringing small gifts: a book he thought she might enjoy, fresh eggs from the ranch, a bag of peppermints from the general store. They would sit in Mrs. Patterson's parlor, always properly chaperoned, and talk for hours. Winona learned that Harrison had been engaged once, back in Missouri, but his fiancée had broken it off when he announced his intention to move west. "She wanted security," he explained. "A house in town, a steady job working for her father's dry goods business. Couldn't understand why I'd give that up to chase a dream. Guess I couldn't understand why she'd want me to give up that dream. We weren't right for each other, not really." "Do you regret it?" Winona asked. Coming west, I mean. Not for a second, Harrison said. Out here, a man can be whatever he has the strength and will to become. Back east, everything's already decided. Your place, your prospects, all set from birth. But here, he gestured expansively. Here, if I work hard enough and save smart enough, I can own land, real land. Can you imagine that? My granddaddy was a sharecropper, barely scraping by. My daddy managed to buy a small farm after years of saving. And me, I'm going to own a ranch. That's only possible out here. Winona understood that ambition, shared it in her own way. I feel the same about teaching, she said. Back in Boston, after father died, the only respectable options were to marry someone appropriate or become a governess for some wealthy family, essentially a servant. But here, I'm the school teacher. I'll have my own classroom, my own authority. I'll shape young minds and earn my own living. I'll be my own person. You already are your own person, Harrison said. That's what I admire about you. You didn't let circumstances break you. You got back up and kept walking, even without boots. Their conversations ranged over everything: books, politics, religion, dreams. They discovered shared loves, like poetry and good horses, and different opinions that sparked friendly debates, like whether Colorado would someday surpass California in importance, or if the railroad had been an entirely good thing for the West. They talked about serious things and silly things, and somewhere in those evening conversations, friendship deepened into something more. Winona found herself watching for Harrison's arrival each day, found her heart racing when she heard his footsteps on the porch. She noticed things about him: the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the calluses on his hands from years of hard work, the gentleness he showed despite his strength. She noticed how other women in the boarding house watched him when he came to call, but how his attention never wavered from her. And Harrison, for his part, was clearly equally affected. Mrs. Patterson, never one to miss anything, commented on it one morning over breakfast after Harrison had left the previous evening looking particularly moonstruck. "That young man is falling in love with you," she said matter-of-factly. "If he hasn't already fallen completely." "It's too soon," Winona protested, but weakly. "Nonsense," Mrs. Patterson said. "My husband proposed 3 days after we met. We were married 42 years before he passed, and I loved him more at the end than at the beginning. When you know, you know. And if you don't feel the same, you'd best tell him soon, before his heart's so committed there's no saving it from breaking." But Winona did feel the same. That was the terrifying, wonderful truth. She was falling in love with Harrison James, the cowboy who had given her his boots and carried her through a blizzard. The man who visited her every evening and looked at her like she was something precious. The man who made her laugh and challenged her thinking, and whose presence made even Mrs. Patterson's cramped parlor feel like the most wonderful place on earth. On the 8th day, Dr. Miller pronounced her healed enough to walk, though he cautioned her to take it easy. Harrison arrived that evening to find her on her feet for the first time since the accident, walking carefully around the parlor in shoes that Mrs. Patterson had procured for her, proper ladies' shoes that fit perfectly. "How do they feel?" he asked, his eyes tracking her every movement with concern. "Strange," Winona admitted. "My feet are tender and I can feel the cold more than I used to, but the doctor says that should improve with time. The important thing is I can walk, which means I can start teaching on Monday." "That's wonderful," Harrison said, and meant it, though Winona detected a note of something else in his voice. Anxiety, perhaps. They sat down in their usual spots, Mrs. Patterson having conveniently remembered urgent business in the kitchen, leaving the parlor doors open for propriety but giving them privacy. Harrison seemed unusually quiet, turning his hat in his hands, clearly working up to something. "I've been thinking," he finally said. About the future. About what I want from life. And, Winona prompted when he fell silent, and I realized that all those plans I've been making, the ranch, the house, building something that lasts, none of it means anything without someone to share it with. He looked up at her, those whiskey eyes intense. I know it's too soon. I know we've only known each other a week. But Winona, I've never felt like this before. When I saw you walking through that snow, something in me just knew, and every day since has only made me more certain. Winona's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must hear it. Certain of what? That you're who I've been saving that ranch for, Harrison said simply. That you're who I want to build a life with. I'm not asking anything of you right now, he added quickly. I know you need to start your position, establish yourself here. I know you need time. But I needed you to know, needed you to understand that when I look at you, I see my future. And I hope someday when you look at me, you might see the same. Winona felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were happy tears. Harrison James, she said, her voice shaking slightly, I already do. I think I have since that first moment, when you gave me your boots without a second thought. When you carried me through the storm and made me feel safe for the first time since my father died. Every conversation we've had has only made me more sure. I'm falling in love with you. No, that's not right. I've already fallen. Completely. The expression on Harrison's face was like sunrise, pure joy breaking across his features. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles with such tenderness it made her breath catch. Marry me, he said. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday soon. Say you'll marry me, Winona Edwards. Say you'll build that life with me. Yes, Winona said, laughing and crying at once. Yes, I'll marry you. Harrison stood and pulled her up into his arms, holding her close, and for a long moment, they simply stood there, hearts beating in tandem, the future spreading out before them like the Colorado landscape, vast and full of possibility. Mrs. Patterson chose that moment to return from the kitchen, took one look at them and smiled. I'll start planning the wedding breakfast, she announced. I assume we'll be needing one soon. Soon enough, Harrison said, grinning, but not too soon. Got to court her proper first, make sure the whole town knows my intentions are honorable. And court her he did. Over the next 3 months, as winter melted into spring and Winona settled into her teaching position, Harrison wooed her with old-fashioned dedication. He attended church with her every Sunday, sitting in the back pew and singing hymns in a surprisingly good baritone. He escorted her to town socials, where they danced, and she met more of the community that would be hers. He brought her to the Double Bar Ranch to meet his employers, Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, who welcomed her warmly and immediately began planning how to adjust Harrison's work schedule to accommodate a wife. He took her to see the land he wanted to buy, riding out on a warm May morning when the valley was carpeted in wildflowers and the creek ran high with snowmelt. They stood on a small rise, Chester grazing nearby, and Harrison pointed out where everything would go. The house here, with a porch facing east to catch the sunrise, the barn there, close enough to be convenient but far enough that the smell wouldn't reach the house, the corrals beyond, and pasture stretching in all directions. It's perfect, Winona said, meaning it. She could see it all, the life they would build here. When can you buy it? That's what I wanted to talk to you about, Harrison said. I've got the money saved now. Was going to buy it this year anyway, but I held off because I wanted to ask you first. It's going to be your home too. If there's something you want different, some other property you'd prefer, now's the time to say. Winona turned to him, this man who had become her entire world, and said, This is perfect. Let's buy it. Let's start building our future. They were married in June, on a Saturday afternoon when the whole town turned out to celebrate. Winona wore a dress that Mrs. Patterson had commissioned from the dressmaker as a wedding gift, ivory silk with lace at the collar and cuffs, and carried wildflowers picked from their land that morning. Harrison wore a new suit that made him look almost uncomfortably formal, though his eyes, when he saw her walking down the church aisle, held nothing but joy and love. The Reverend performed the ceremony, talking about the sanctity of marriage and the bonds of love, but Winona barely heard the words. She was too focused on Harrison, on the way he held her hands like they were precious, on the emotion in his voice when he said his vows, on the gentle kiss he gave her when the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife. The reception was held at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, the entire first floor given over to the celebration. There was food and music and dancing, and toasts that made Winona blush and Harrison grin. When someone asked how they met, Harrison told the story of finding her walking barefoot through the snow, of giving her his boots and carrying her to safety, and the room fell silent with the romance of it. "I knew right then," Harrison said, his arm around Winona's waist. "The moment I saw her, fighting through that storm, refusing to give up, I knew she was the strongest person I'd ever meet. I knew I wanted to spend my life making sure she never had to fight alone again." "And I knew," Winona added, her hand over his, "when he gave me his boots without hesitation, when he carried me through the blizzard and tended my injuries with such care, that he was the kind of man worth building a life with, the kind of man worth loving with everything I had." They spent their wedding night at the ranch house Harrison had been building since purchasing the land in May. It was small still, just 2 rooms and a loft, but it was theirs, built with Harrison's own hands and furnished with pieces they had collected together. Harrison carried her over the threshold, a tradition he insisted on despite Winona's laughing protests that it was silly. "Nothing silly about it," he said, setting her down in their small parlor. "You're my wife now. This is our home. I want to do everything proper." Their wedding night was tender and sweet, Harrison patient and gentle, Winona nervous but trusting. They learned each other in the lamplight, and when Winona fell asleep in her husband's arms, she felt a peace and happiness she had never imagined possible. The following months were filled with hard work and deeper joy than Winona had known existed. She continued teaching, now riding to school each day on a gentle mare Harrison had bought for her, named Daisy. Harrison worked their land, building up their herd with careful purchases, improving the property bit by bit. They worked together in the evenings, Winona helping with ranch accounts while Harrison repaired tack or planned the next day's work. Their first winter together, the snows came hard and early, and one evening as they sat by the fire, Winona found herself remembering that day Harrison had found her. "You ever think about it?" she asked. "That day in the snow. How different everything might have been if you'd taken a different path, if you hadn't found me." Harrison pulled her closer, his arm around her shoulders. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted. "Think about how close I came to losing you before I ever knew you. Makes me grateful for every day we have." "I never properly thanked you," Winona said, "for the boots, for carrying me, for saving my life." "Yes, you did," Harrison said. "You married me. You're building this life with me. That's all the thanks I'll ever need." In February of 1883, exactly a year after they met, Winona told Harrison she was expecting a child. He was mending fence when she rode out to tell him, unable to wait until evening, and the look on his face when she gave him the news was something she would treasure forever. "A baby," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "We're having a baby, we are," Winona confirmed, laughing as he swept her up and spun her around, then immediately set her down with apologies, worried he had been too rough. Their son was born in late September, a healthy boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's determination. They named him Henry Edward James, combining both their families, and Harrison cried when he held him for the first time, this tiny life they had created together. Winona watched her husband with their son, saw the gentleness and love he showed, and fell in love with him all over again. This was the man who had given her his boots in a blizzard, who had carried her to safety, who had courted her with patience and married her with joy. This was the man who now cradled their child and sang lullabies in that surprisingly good baritone, who walked the floor at night when Henry fussed, who looked at his wife and son like they were his entire world. The years that followed were good ones. The ranch prospered, growing slowly but steadily. Harrison proved to have his foreman's same gift for knowing good cattle and good land. Winona continued teaching until Henry's birth, then occasionally took students at home, supplementing their income while raising their son. Henry was 2 when they learned another child was on the way, and Harrison immediately began planning an addition to the house. Their daughter, Grace Lily, was born in the spring of 1886, a fair-haired, blue-eyed angel who had her father wrapped around her tiny finger from the first moment. The land they had bought, that valley Harrison had shown Winona when they were courting, became everything they had dreamed. The house grew to accommodate their growing family. The herds increased. They hired hands to help during busy seasons, and Harrison's reputation as a fair employer and skilled rancher spread. In 1888, when Winona was 28 and Harrison 31, they welcomed their third child, another son they named Thomas Warren. Their family felt complete then, 3 healthy children and a ranch that was finally everything they had worked toward. But the greatest gift, the one Winona treasured above all others, was the love she shared with Harrison. It had not diminished with time or familiarity. Instead, it had deepened, maturing into something solid and enduring. They still sat together in the evenings, still talked for hours, still looked at each other with the same wonder they had felt in Mrs. Patterson's parlor all those years ago. On their 10th anniversary, Harrison took Winona back to the line shack where they had weathered that first storm together. It was maintained now, kept stocked with supplies as a safety measure for anyone caught out in bad weather, but it was still recognizably the same small structure where their relationship had begun. "You remember?" Harrison asked, standing in the doorway with his arm around Winona's waist. "Every moment," Winona said. "I remember thinking I was going to die. I remember hearing your horse and thinking it was a miracle. I remember you taking off your boots without hesitation." "Best decision I ever made," Harrison said. "Well, second best. First best was asking you to marry me." "Third best was accepting," Winona teased. "First was not dying in that blizzard. Second was saying yes to you." They laughed together, that easy laughter of 2 people completely comfortable with each other. Then Harrison grew more serious. "I want you to know," he said, "that every day with you has been better than I imagined when I was planning this life alone. You've made everything brighter, richer, more meaningful. You've given me a family, a real home, a purpose beyond just surviving and accumulating land. You've given me happiness, Winona, more than I ever thought I'd have." Winona felt tears prick her eyes, the good kind, the kind that came from overwhelming love. "You gave me the same," she said. "You gave me a home when I had nothing. You gave me love when I was alone. You gave me a life worth living, Harrison James, and I fall more in love with you every single day." They kissed there in the doorway of the line shack, the June sun warm on their backs, their children playing near Chester and Daisy, who were grazing nearby. It was a perfect moment, the kind that defines a life, and they both knew it. The years continued to pass, bringing the usual joys and sorrows of life. Harrison's mother passed in 1892, and though he grieved, he took comfort in knowing he had made her proud, that the money he had sent over the years had eased her final days. One of his sisters and her family moved to Colorado in 1894, settling in Aspen proper, and the children delighted in having cousins nearby. Winona's teaching career never fully ended. As her children grew, she began teaching again, part-time at first, then taking over as the primary school teacher when the previous teacher retired. She loved shaping young minds, loved seeing her students grow and thrive. Some of them went on to college back east, some stayed in Aspen to build their own lives, but all remembered Mrs. James with fondness. Henry grew tall and serious, with his father's work ethic and his mother's love of books. Grace was spirited and loving, equally comfortable helping her father with the cattle or helping her mother with lessons. Thomas was the adventurer, always exploring, always asking questions, always testing boundaries in ways that made his parents alternately proud and exasperated. By the time 1900 rolled around, marking the turn of the century, Harrison and Winona were established pillars of their community. Their ranch, the Running Creek Ranch as they had named it, was one of the most successful in the area. Their children were growing into fine young adults. Their love was a local legend, the story of the cowboy who gave up his boots and carried a freezing teacher through a blizzard told and retold until it took on the quality of myth. But for Harrison and Winona, it was simply their story, their truth, the foundation on which they had built everything else. On a cold February evening in 1902, exactly 20 years after they met, Winona and Harrison sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the snow-covered mountains in shades of pink and gold. The children were inside, the sounds of their laughter and gentle arguing drifting through the windows. Chester and Daisy had long since passed, replaced by younger horses, but the ranch itself was eternal, or as eternal as anything human could be. 20 years, Winona said softly. Can you believe it? Some days it feels like yesterday, Harrison said, his hand finding hers with the ease of long practice. Some days it feels like forever. All of it feels like exactly what was supposed to happen. You ever regret it? Winona asked. Giving me your boots, everything that came after. Harrison turned to look at her, this woman who had been the center of his world for 2 decades, and smiled. Not for one single second. You were worth cold feet, Winona. You were worth everything. You were worth walking through that blizzard to find, Winona replied. Worth every hard moment since. Worth every joy. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell and stars began to appear in the vast Colorado sky. Inside, their children called them to supper, and they rose together, hands still linked, and went inside to the warmth and light and love they had built together. Years continued their steady march. Henry married a local girl in 1904, a sensible young woman who worked as a nurse, and they settled on land adjacent to the ranch, starting their own small spread. Grace attended a teacher's college in Denver and returned to teach in Aspen, following in her mother's footsteps. Thomas, ever the adventurer, went to Montana to work on a larger cattle operation, though he visited often and wrote weekly letters detailing his exploits. Harrison and Winona became grandparents in 1905, when Henry and his wife welcomed a son. More grandchildren followed over the years, and the house they had built expanded again to accommodate family gatherings that grew larger and louder with each generation. The ranch continued to prosper, though Harrison gradually turned over more of the daily operations to Henry and the hands they employed, content to advise and oversee rather than do all the physical labor himself. His body bore the marks of decades of hard work, joints that ached on cold mornings, calloused hands that trembled slightly, but his eyes remained sharp and his mind sharper. Winona retired from teaching in 1910, at age 50, though she continued to tutor students privately and was always available to help with school matters when needed. She spent her time reading, gardening, managing the household, and spoiling her grandchildren in the way grandmothers have done since time immemorial. But mostly, she spent her time with Harrison. They had grown old together, these two people who had found each other in a blizzard, and if their bodies were not what they once were, their love remained constant. They still held hands. They still talked for hours. They still looked at each other with wonder and gratitude for the gift of having found each other. In 1915, on a warm summer evening, Harrison and Winona sat on their porch watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Thomas had returned from Montana with a wife and a child of his own, and the ranch felt full of life and love. "We did good," Harrison said contentedly. "Look at all this. Look at what came from one moment, one choice in a blizzard." "We did very good," Winona agreed, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Though I think the credit goes mostly to you. You were the one brave enough to give up your boots for a stranger. And you were brave enough to keep walking until I found you," Harrison said. "Brave enough to build a life in a strange place with a man you barely knew. Brave enough to take every risk this life required. That's real courage, Winona. That's why all this happened." "We were both brave," Winona said. "And we were both lucky. Lucky that you found me. Lucky that we found each other." They watched the children play as the sun set, painting the sky in familiar colors, and felt the deep satisfaction of a life well lived. They had built something lasting, something that would continue long after they were gone. Children and grandchildren who carried their love forward. Land that would feed and shelter future generations. Stories that would be told and retold, of a cowboy who gave up his boots in a blizzard and a teacher who walked through snow to find her future. As autumn came and then winter, Harrison's health began to decline. Nothing dramatic, just the slow winding down of a body that had worked hard for over 6 decades. He spent more time in his chair, less time outside, but his mind remained clear and his love for Winona as strong as ever. On a February evening in 1916, with snow falling gently outside and his children and grandchildren gathered around, Harrison James passed peacefully in his sleep, Winona's hand in his, her voice the last thing he heard as she whispered how much she loved him, how grateful she was for every moment they had shared. The funeral was attended by what seemed like half the county, a testament to the man Harrison had been and the life he had lived. He was buried on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a view of the valley he had loved and a simple stone that read, "Harrison James, 1857–1916, beloved husband, father, grandfather." He gave her his boots. Winona lived another 12 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, still sharp and engaged until the very end. She never remarried, never even considered it. Harrison had been her great love, her partner, her everything, and no one could replace him. She spent her final years telling stories to her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, about the old days, about their grandfather, about a time when the West was still wild and anything seemed possible. Her favorite story, the one she never tired of telling, was about a cowboy who found her walking barefoot through a blizzard, who gave her his boots without hesitation, who carried her to safety and stole her heart in the process. "He was the best man I ever knew," she would say, her old eyes distant with memory. "Strong and gentle, brave and kind. He saved my life that day in the snow, but he did more than that. He gave me a life worth living. He gave me love and home and family. He gave me everything." When Winona died peacefully in her sleep in 1928, at the age of 68, she was buried beside Harrison on that hill overlooking the ranch. Her stone read, Winona Edwards James, 1860–1928, beloved wife, mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, teacher. She walked through the snow and found her home. The Running Creek Ranch continued for generations, passed down through Henry's line and then his children's children. The story of how it began, of Harrison and Winona and a blizzard and a pair of boots given in kindness, became family legend and then local history, told and retold until everyone in the county knew it. The line shack where they had sheltered was eventually rebuilt, but kept as a memorial of sorts, with a plaque explaining its significance. Young couples would sometimes ride out there, hoping some of Harrison and Winona's lasting love would rub off on them. The love story of the cowboy and the schoolteacher became the standard by which other romances were measured. It was invoked at weddings and anniversaries, used as an example of what real love looked like, of what it meant to commit to another person completely and build a life together through hard work and devotion. But the true legacy was not in the stories or the plaques or even the ranch itself. The true legacy was in the generations of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried Harrison and Winona's values forward, who understood that love meant sacrifice and devotion, that home was something you built with your hands and heart, that the greatest gift you could give another person was your whole self, freely offered. They had started with nothing, a woman walking barefoot through snow, a cowboy who gave her his boots. They had built everything, a ranch, a family, a love that lasted beyond death and lived on in stories and memories and the continued existence of all they had created together. It was a simple story, really. Boy meets girl, boy saves girl, boy and girl fall in love. But in its simplicity was something profound, something that spoke to the fundamental human need for connection, for love, for someone who would give you their boots when you needed them most and carry you when you could not walk on your own. Harrison and Winona's story became part of Colorado history, a reminder of the kinds of people who had built the West, who had faced hardship and danger and uncertainty, and created lives of meaning and purpose. Their descendants continued to thrive, spreading across the state and beyond, but always remembering where they came from, always telling the story of the cowboy and the schoolteacher who found each other in a blizzard. In 1976, on the centennial of Colorado's statehood, the Historical Society erected a marker near the site where Harrison had found Winona, commemorating their story and what it represented about the pioneer spirit. The marker read, Near this spot in February 1882, cowboy Harrison James found teacher Winona Edwards walking barefoot through a blizzard after a stagecoach accident. He gave her his boots, carried her to safety, and eventually married her. Their ranch, the Running Creek Ranch, and their descendants continue to be part of Colorado's living history. This marker commemorates not just their story but all the stories of courage, kindness, and love that built this state. The Running Creek Ranch itself was eventually designated a historical landmark, still working land, but also a reminder of Colorado's past. Tours were given, showing the original small house that Harrison built, now preserved as a museum, explaining how the ranch grew and prospered, telling the story of the family who had built it. And always, the story came back to that moment in the snow. To a woman walking barefoot, facing death with courage. To a cowboy who gave her his boots without hesitation. To the love that blossomed from that moment of kindness, a love so strong it lasted a lifetime and beyond. Because that was the truth at the heart of everything Harrison and Winona had built together. That love was a choice, made again and again, day after day, year after year. That real love meant seeing someone in need and responding without thought of cost. That the best things in life came from being brave enough to walk forward, even when the path was unclear and dangerous, and being fortunate enough to find someone brave enough to walk beside you. Harrison had given Winona his boots and carried her through a blizzard to safety. But in doing so, he had given her so much more. A future, a home, a family, a love that sustained her through all the years of her life. And Winona, in accepting those boots, in letting herself be carried, in choosing to build a life with the man who had saved her, had given Harrison everything he had ever dreamed of and more. Theirs was a love story for the ages, simple and profound, specific to their time and place but universal in its message. That kindness matters. That love endures. That sometimes the most important moment of your life comes when you least expect it, in the form of a stranger on horseback offering boots in a snowstorm. And that story, that legacy, continued to inspire long after both Harrison and Winona had returned to the earth they had loved and worked and built upon. Their love lived on in their descendants, in the ranch they had created, in the stories told around dinner tables and at family gatherings, in the example they had set of what it meant to build a life together with courage and devotion and unwavering love. They had given each other everything, these two people who had found each other in a blizzard. And in doing so, they had created something that lasted forever. A love that transcended death, a legacy that enriched generations, a story that would be told as long as people valued courage and kindness, and the transformative power of love freely given. The snow still fell in Colorado winters, blanketing the mountains and valleys in white, but now when it did, those who knew the story would sometimes think of Harrison and Winona, of boots given in kindness, and a woman carried to safety, of a love that began in a blizzard and lasted beyond death. And in thinking of them, in remembering their story, people were reminded of what really mattered in life. Not wealth or status or power, but love, kindness, and the courage to give of yourself completely to another person. That was the true gift Harrison and Winona gave to all who heard their story. The reminder that love was worth any sacrifice, that home was anywhere you built it with someone you loved, and that sometimes the most extraordinary lives began with the simplest acts of kindness. A cowboy giving up his boots, a woman brave enough to accept help, two hearts recognizing each other in the middle of a storm and choosing to walk forward together into whatever future awaited them. It was a good story, a true story, a love story. And like all the best love stories, it had a happy ending, not because life was always easy, but because two people had chosen each other and committed to building something lasting, something beautiful, something that would outlive them both and continue to inspire long after they were gone. That was the real miracle, not the boots or the rescue or even the romance, but the life they built together afterward, day by ordinary day, choice by choice, year by year, until their love became something unshakable, something that death itself could not diminish. Harrison and Winona James had found each other in a blizzard, and they had created a love that warmed generations.